We're getting into our Mailbag Monday. Once again, if you ever want to send in a question for Mailbag Monday, send me an email to Cody@CodyWorkNFL.com. Ask me your question, tell me your name, and where you're from. We're going to start things off here from Jeff from Broomfield. And he says that, would you say that Max Duffy, the Broncos' newest signing at punter, would be an upgrade over Sam Martin, both financially and physically? I think financially, Jeff, yes, because he's a younger player. You can get him at a bargain. Sam Martin's been in the league. He has 10 years. So he's going to cost a little bit more. The Broncos have 2 more years on his contract. Now, in terms of physically, I think it's a big risk, right? Because Max Duffy, according to many University of Kentucky fans that I speak to, he's a weapon. He has the ability to be a really damn good player. But the question that I have, and this is where I'm skeptical, this is why I think that it's important that you have competition in training camp, and you need to see it in preseason games, though, because we know the roster cut down dates. The first one from 90, I believe, to 85 is after the first preseason game, and then it just goes on and dwindles on from second game to third game. You have to see what both of these guys can do. So in preseason, you alternate who's punting first, who's punting second, and then maybe the next game, whoever had the hot hand that first game gets to start off as the punter. Both players are good directional punters, which is why Sam Martin was a pretty good fit in Tom McMahon's scheme. I touched on it on last week's episode, Locked On Broncos, after we were talking about the Duffy signing, where Sam Martin, he's the guy that can directional punt it to the sideline, to the right side, to the left side. You don't see too much of it in the middle of the field. Now, for Duffy, physically, he does have, in my opinion, I feel like a really big leg right now. Maybe that's because he's younger and he comes from that background playing the Australian football down there, but the question that I have is, do you risk going younger and cheaper and maybe compromise performance? Special teams has been killer for Denver. Denver has struggled in terms of the punter realm for the last couple of years. Sam Martin made that better significantly. Sam Martin was a massive upgrade over what the Broncos have had since Britton Cole quit. So that tells you how long it's been since the Broncos have had a really good punter. They didn't really give Marquette King any time to develop and actually do what he can do best, because he was forced to change his technique to punt to the left sideline or to the right sideline. We know that Marquette King could boom it. He never really got the chance to do it, had that injury. The change of technique really impacted things, and it created some issues. So for Max Duffy, if he can come into camp and he can really challenge and push Sam Martin, then yes, I would say that maybe he'd be an upgrade. But as of right now, it's a big question mark, because you risk losing that experience of a really good punter versus a guy who's young and inexperienced. That, to me, I think is a tough decision to make if you're a general manager. But, Jeff, thank you for your question. Katie from Salt Lake City, Utah says, what are your thoughts on whether or not players should show up for OTAs? You know, Katie, I was touching on this a little bit last week, but for OTAs, voluntary team activities, organized team activities, the voluntary part is completely that voluntary. Phase 1, we know, is you can show up to the team facility, you can work out. There's no football terminology. There's no working with coaches. Phase 2, it changes. You can work with coaches at a teaching pace. And it's good to be around your teammates. Now, for me personally, if I was an NFL athlete, I would be at OTAs. That's just my personal preference. However, I don't have any beef or disagreement with players that decide not to show up for OTAs, because it is voluntary. And, you know, they have advisement based on their agents, the NFLPA, the union telling them that, hey, you know, during this situation, maybe you don't show up for this. You don't have to, but if you want to, you can. And I think that the nature and the pressure that we've really seen with OTAs and the optics of it, Katie, is that we've seen these players get hurt away from the team facility, and it encourages people even more like, hey, if I'm going to work out, I need to go do it at the team facility. That way, if I do get hurt, I'm covered, I'm protected, my money is secure. And I think that's really just kind of the strong tactic that the NFL and the NFLPA have in terms of the CBA as it pertains to players and where they go. To be honest with you, I think most players would prefer to work out at the team facility if it weren't for some of these pressures faced by the NFL and the NFLPA. If they knew that they were secure away from the facility and also at the facility, we would see probably more buy-in. Now, obviously, COVID has been a big thing that's kind of thrown a little bit of a wrench into the plans of people really wanting to be there. It really depends on who's vaccinated, who's not. And the NFL, they're incentivizing players that are getting vaccinated. And so we'll see how things open up. But you know, I feel indifferent to it. You know, it's nice to see players there, especially veteran players. It's nice to get them back. Von Miller's been there, so that says a lot about where he is at. Workout bonuses have a lot to do with it. But either way, if a player doesn't show up or if they show up, it's not going to make me change my perspective on it, because I can see it from both sides. If I was a player, I'd be there. But I do see why players would not be there as well, because it is completely voluntary. But There's different motives, different strokes for different folks. But thank you for your question, Katie. We're going to Will from Eugene, Oregon. Hey, Eugene, Oregon. Hey, I'm going to be there this summer. Will, if you're if you're free, let me take you out. Let's get a cup of coffee. We'll talk even more, man. I appreciate that. He says, big fan of the show, Cody. Thanks for all of your interaction. Do you believe that the change in offensive philosophy in the NFL today benefits younger coaches or veteran coaches more? I think it depends on the context, Will. When we talk about these young offensive minds like the Sean McVay, I mean, he's young in terms of stature, what you see in coaches, but, he's not like the young guy. He's not like the 24, 25-year-old young guy that has all these different philosophies on throwing the football 50 times a game. I do think that when we compare how the NFL is today, we've seen it spread out to more of the spread game. Not too many inline tight ends at the college level now. So a lot of these offenses in the NFL, they're becoming more college style, more pro ready. And you're seeing this expansion on going empty 3-by-1, and where you have 3 receivers to one side, 1 on the other, going empty to where you may have 3 receivers to one side or 4 receivers to one side, 1 or 2 on the other side, and just going all passing it out. And I think it goes back to that Kansas City Chiefs game versus the LA Rams. It was that 54-48 shootout that the Rams had won a few years ago. People like those games because it's entertaining, but I can tell you this, as a defensive-minded guy, as a head coach, it would drive me absolute bat crazy, man, because I like those games where it's 10-3, 10-7, defensive games where your defense is shutting them down. It's very rare we see that in the NFL today. It's super rare because there's so many talented players at the skill player position. In terms of offensive philosophy, it's really about how can we attack every blade of grass. And when you play zone coverage, there's soft spots depending on what type of coverage you're playing, where offensive coordinators and smart offensive coordinators at that, if you have a good quarterback and you have good personnel, you know how to exploit that. You know how to attack that. That's why we see Kansas City so successful. They have a really good offensive-minded head coach. He's not a young guy. He's a veteran guy. He's been around the game. And so he understands how to adapt what he can do philosophy-wise to the personnel around him. Now, in terms of the young guys, everyone wants the younger offensive-minded head coach, but it doesn't always work out in terms of productivity and success. There are so many different outliers, team around you, environment. Now, for veteran coaches too, maybe Andy Reid is the exception here, but a lot of old-school coaches, guys who've been coaching, coordinating offenses for quite some time, they are so stuck in their ways sometimes that they don't evolve to the natural times. They don't evolve to the talent and the personnel around them. A lot of times back probably in the 2000s, it was, the players need to adapt their abilities to our scheme, not like the coaches adapting the scheme to their players. It was the expectation that players were supposed to do whatever the scheme asked them, and there was no blend, there was no mesh there. Now I think it's equal. You see a compromise of what your personnel can do by coaches based on the talent that you have, and you also have players who are buying into the scheme, into the culture. That is a big difference maker there, but I do think that it benefits everybody. I think if you're Vic Fangio, a very, very experienced defensive coordinator, you're going against a young offensive mind. You have that experience on how to adjust quickly. You can see what they're doing, make the adjustment, whereas that offensive coordinator may not understand how to adjust to your defense. So I'd say that's a benefit of having Vic being a veteran defensive-minded guy. But Will, great question, my friend. Our final one here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos Mailbag Monday. John in Denver says, who has the most pressure to perform in 2021? Vic Fangio or Pat Shurmur? John, this is a great question, and I've been thinking about this a lot because when I look at the Broncos, I look at George Paton, I look at the offseason, I see the moves that he's done to put a very strong defensive nucleus around for Vic Fangio to utilize. It gives me more and more confidence that Vic Fangio will be back after 2021. And if anybody goes, let's say the offense continues to struggle, I don't personally believe that Vic Fangio will be on the chopping block. I believe it's going to be Pat Shurmur. I believe Pat Shurmur would be on the chopping block more so than you would see Vic. If Vic's defense is playing really dang well, you're not going to scrap that. You're not going to rob Paul to pay Peter. Yes, Vic is the head coach. Winning games ultimately does fall on his responsibility, but he's in charge of giving suggestions to the offensive coordinator. During a game, let's say it's 3rd and 4, he'll come up and he'll have the feedback. He'll talk to Pat Shurmur and he'll say, hey, they're doing this defensively. We need to figure out how to adjust to it. Or this play's not working. This formation's not working. We need to try something different. He gives that suggestion to the offensive coordinator. It's the offensive coordinator's job to carry it over, make those necessary changes, or to get the offense to play better. It's not all on Vic. Vic leads the whole team. Yes, part of that does fall under him in terms of that because the offensive coordinator answers to you as the head coach. But that's where things get muddy. That's where the water gets muddy, because you see so many people talking about fire Vic Fangio. But the reality is, if the offense isn't performing and the offense is becoming too predictable, that's not Vic Fangio. That's the offensive coordinator. So Pat Shurmur, this is a big year for him. I feel like Pat Shurmur has more pressure on him for the offense to succeed, to take the next step, more so than the quarterback position has. Whether it's Drew Lock or Teddy Bridgewater or somebody else, the pressure's on Pat Shurmur, in my opinion. If the offense struggles this year, we could see the Broncos make a change, maybe in season or maybe next season. A lot of it depends on the trajectory of where this team goes, but I think that Vic, I have a strong feeling, even if the Broncos struggle this year, I think Vic will be back in 2022.